He still remembers the sound of the soles on cracked pavement, the rough rhythm of a boy's sprint echoing off the narrow alleyways of Sepolia, Athens. That neighborhood, raw and unadorned, didn't have basketball courts with shiny floors or rows of cheering fans. It had rusted hoops with no nets, walls covered in graffiti, and baskets nailed to whatever flat surface kids could find. It had hunger, sometimes cold, sometimes heat, but always motion. Always that pulse of restless energy. And in the middle of it all, a boy, tall for his age, thin like a sapling, chasing a dream without even knowing what to call it. Giannis didn't own a pair of basketball shoes, not at first. He ran barefoot or wore whatever his brothers weren't using that day. Some days it was an old pair of soccer cleats with the studs worn down to nubs. Other days, sandals held together by tape. They shared everything: meals, dreams, chores, disappointments. And somewhere along those long walks to sell trinkets on the streets with Thanasis, he started watching the other kids play. That's where the rhythm began. The game found him before he found a ball. It was the elegance of it, the improvisation, the movement, the way you could be poor and still dominate a game just by playing harder than the guy across from you. The first time he held a real basketball, it felt too smooth, too perfect, like it didn't belong in his hands. He fumbled it, dropped it, chased it down and tried again. Day after day on cracked asphalt with a ring made of metal piping, he practiced. He didn't know what NBA meant. He just knew he didn't want to be invisible forever. And then came the shoes. They weren't new, in fact they barely held together. A neighbor who saw him play on the corner court had a cousin who was discarding a pair of size 46 basketball sneakers, too big for the cousin's feet, too perfect for Giannis to care. The day they were handed to him, Giannis held them like treasure. They were white once, now smudged into a grayish tone. The laces were uneven, one longer than the other. The left sole was peeling at the toe. There was a scratch down the side, a fading Nike swoosh almost too worn to see. But when he slipped his feet into them, everything changed. They didn't fit, not really, but they didn't need to. He stuffed the toes with newspaper, curled his socks tight around his ankles and tied them so tight the skin on his shins turned pink. He didn't complain. He didn't blink. That first day he wore them, he ran until his lungs burned. He played with something new coursing through his blood, not just hope but legitimacy. The other kids noticed. "You got shoes now, Gianni?" one of them teased. He nodded. No smile, just pride. That night he didn't take them off for hours. He cleaned the surface with an old toothbrush. He smoothed the laces, dried the inside with a hairdryer borrowed from his mother's boss. He placed them beside his bed like they were sacred. He remembers the first layup he made in those shoes. Not because it was graceful, it wasn't, but because his foot slipped midair and he landed hard on his side. The shoes had no grip left. But even through the fall, the laughter, the bruised ribs, he smiled. Because he knew now that he wasn't just chasing dreams barefoot. He had tools. Maybe broken ones, but tools nonetheless. Weeks turned into months. The shoes began to fall apart. The tongue of the left one detached completely. The fabric tore near the heel. But he kept wearing them. Through pickup games, through long walks home, through rain. One night, after slipping on a wet corner, he sat on a bench and cried, holding the shoes in his lap. He wasn't crying because he was hurt. He was crying because he feared they were dying. That the shoes, like so many good things in his life, were temporary. His mother tried to sew them. Thanasis offered to trade shoes with him again. But Giannis wouldn't let go. They had become more than shoes. They were the first thing that made him feel real, like he belonged to something bigger, like basketball had claimed him back. He began to play with more confidence, his steps sharper, his movement more fluid. Coaches started noticing. One in particular, Spiros Veliniatis, stopped him after a game and asked his name. That question opened a door Giannis never thought existed. But even as the trials began, even as he started to glimpse a life beyond Sepolia, he kept returning to those shoes. He wore them until there was nothing left but memory. Eventually they vanished, left behind somewhere between practice and poverty, maybe stolen, maybe lost, maybe simply discarded after the last lace tore clean away. For years he didn't think about them, or at least he told himself that. But every time he tied a new pair before a game, Every time Nike delivered a fresh box with his own signature line inside, he'd feel a tug, a quiet reminder of what once was. What those shoes represented could never be replicated. He didn't know then that one day they'd find him again. He didn't know that time could loop like that objects could survive like spirits. All he knew, in that first moment when he felt rubber meet asphalt and realized it was his foot making the noise, was this. He wasn't just wearing shoes. He was stepping into his future. The day had been like many others. Obligations, appearances, a little chaos wrapped in calm. Giannis had learned how to manage it all, how to smile for photos, sign jerseys, shake hands with politicians and fans alike. He'd grown into it, like a tree adjusting to wind. Milwaukee had become more than a team city. It was his second home. And today's event, a charity auction hosted by a local sports foundation, was part of his commitment to give back. He arrived early, greeted organizers, and slipped into the rhythm of the event without fanfare. The room buzzed with excitement, memorabilia, silent auctions, flashes of nostalgia hanging on every wall. He hadn't expected to feel anything. Events like this were common. Jerseys from old stars, signed balls, vintage trading cards, even game-worn shoes from famous players now long retired. He moved through the displays out of courtesy, more curious than engaged. A pair of Ray Allen's Heat sneakers here, a signed Bucks poster there. Then he saw it. It was just a small glass case tucked away near the back, surrounded by more modest items, forgotten high school trophies, a cracked Spalding ball, a few faded caps. Nothing fancy, but some echo pulled him in. He felt it before he saw it, that creeping gravity of memory, slow and undeniable. His eyes dropped to the case. There they were. He blinked. They couldn't be. They were. The same smudged white, yellowed by time, the same frayed edges, the same over-tightened laces, still uneven. His hand reached for the glass unconsciously. His breath slowed. He couldn't hear the room anymore. His fingers hovered near the surface, just a few inches from a ghost. A man in a blazer, the auction curator approached and began explaining casually. The shoes had been donated anonymously, acquired from a second-hand store in Athens by a traveling collector nearly a decade ago, kept in storage. The label called them youth basketball shoes, unknown origin. But Giannis wasn't listening to the words. His eyes traced every scuff, every crease. His mind was 20 years away. He didn't need authentication. He knew. The curator noticed his silence, paused. "Are they familiar to you, Mr. Antetokounmpo?" Giannis didn't answer right away. His mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come. His body was here, but everything inside him had collapsed into that one moment of recognition. It wasn't about the shoes, not really. It was about who he was when he wore them. The hunger, the weight, the hope. And now here they were, survivors, time-worn and fragile, but still standing. He finally spoke, voice low and trembling. These were mine." The curator looked stunned. "Yours?" Giannis nodded, eyes still fixed on them. "My first, my only for a long time." A crowd was gathering, quietly, sensing something extraordinary. Whispers began to ripple through the room. He bent down, slowly, as if afraid the moment might shatter. And then, gently, like handling a wounded bird, he lifted the glass cover. His hands moved instinctively. He didn't ask permission. Nobody stopped him. He picked up the left shoe first, turned it over in his palm, touched the split tongue, the sole's torn corner. The inside, where his initials were faintly visible, written in faded marker, G.A. He exhaled deeply. "I can't believe they survived." He sat on a nearby bench. Silence fell over the space. He was holding time in his hands. A woman nearby raised her phone to film, but stopped halfway. Something about the moment asked for reverence. His thumb brushed the outer heel. "Right here," he whispered. "This tear. I remember. I caught it on the wire fence trying to chase down a rebound." His voice grew softer, like he was speaking only to the shoes, to his past self. "I thought they were lost. I thought I'd never see them again." And then, unexpectedly, tears. They rose, unbidden, from a place deeper than he could name. He didn't wipe them. He let them fall. The room held its breath. He cradled the pair in his lap, and the memories came like rain. Days of playing until the sun dipped below the rooftops, sore feet, empty stomach, laughing with his brothers. His mother watching from a distance, never saying much, just nodding when he asked if he could play a little longer. Nights lying awake, staring at those shoes beside his mattress, wondering if the future could hear him dreaming. A reporter moved forward gently, microphone lowered, unsure whether to ask anything at all. Giannis glanced at her and shook his head softly. Not yet, not here. He stood after a while, shoes still in hand, and faced the organizer. I want to take them. There was a pause. I'll pay whatever the auction asks, double, triple. But the curator hesitated. Actually, someone already placed a high bid. They were going to be part of a historical display in the Athens Sports Museum. Giannis fell quiet. Of course. That felt right, somehow. Like the shoes had found their way home through another route. They weren't his anymore, not really. They belonged to every kid still running barefoot on cracked courts, still believing with nothing in their hands but faith. He nodded. Then let them go back. They deserved to be seen. The curator asked if he wanted to add a note to the exhibit. Giannis smiled through his tears. I'll write something. He placed the shoes gently back into the case. His hands lingered over them. Then slowly, reverently, he closed the glass. Behind him, people clapped, softly at first, then louder. Not the wild cheering of a game-winning dunk, but something gentler, a recognition, a collective exhale of shared awe. Giannis turned, offered a grateful smile, and walked away slowly. Not triumphant, not overwhelmed, just still, grounded. As if for the first time in a long while, he had reconnected with the raw, unfinished boy who started it all. That night, long after the crowd had gone home and the lights dimmed, he sat alone in his car. The city outside was quiet. He took out his phone and stared at a photo someone had taken of him holding the shoes. For a while he said nothing, just watched. Then, softly, he whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't clear who he was speaking to, the shoes, the past, God, himself. Maybe all of them. He didn't need to know. What mattered was that something lost had found him again, and this time he was ready to carry it forward. The day after the auction, the sun rose slowly over Milwaukee, filtered through soft clouds that gave the city a kind of quiet calm. Giannis didn't have practice, no games, no press, no obligations. But his mind wasn't still. He kept seeing the shoes, not just in memory, not just in photos, but viscerally in his hands, in the way they felt like they hummed with time. He hadn't slept much, not because of sadness or unrest, but because something had settled in his chest that he couldn't name. Not closure, something more alive than that, as if a forgotten thread had been pulled back into the weave of his life. He sat alone at his kitchen table, pen in hand, staring at a blank piece of paper. The museum had asked him to write a short note for the exhibit, a paragraph, maybe two, something that gave context. But every time he started, the words felt too small, too polished, too distant from the truth. So he crumpled the first draft, then the second, the third. His hands that had delivered championships, trophies, thousands of points, couldn't seem to write a simple letter about a pair of old shoes, until he stopped trying to write for others. He began again, slowly, this time as if speaking to the boy he used to be. "To anyone who stands where I once stood," he began. "These shoes were not just shoes. They were belief. They were my introduction to the impossible. When I laced them up, I wasn't in Athens anymore. I was somewhere far beyond the streets of Sepolia. I was already halfway into my dream, even when I didn't know how big that dream could be." The letter grew. It became a full page, then two. He poured into it everything that had gone unsaid. The hunger, the fear, the strength drawn from nothing, the sacredness of perseverance. He wrote not just for the exhibit, but for every young kid who might one day stand in front of that glass case and see more than a worn-out pair of sneakers. "These shoes walked with me when no one else saw me," he wrote. "They were torn and second-hand, but they made me feel new. They didn't make me faster or stronger, but they made me brave. When the letter was finished, he folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope, and called his team. He didn't want the letter read by press or posted online. It wasn't for that. It was meant to live with the shoes quietly inside the museum. A secret gift. But the story didn't stop there. A few weeks later, Giannis was invited to Athens for the official unveiling of the exhibit. He hadn't returned in months, maybe longer. And this time, he wasn't just a son of the city. He was a symbol, a legend who had walked its streets with holes in his socks and now returned with the world at his back. He arrived quietly, slipping into the building before the ceremony, escorted by staff and greeted with warm, reverent smiles. He was taken to the exhibit room before the crowd filtered in. There they were again. The shoes, resting in a glass pedestal under a soft light, surrounded by a minimalist display. And beneath them his letter, open now, framed beside a small plaque with his name. He stood in silence. This time, he didn't cry. He didn't need to. It wasn't about sadness. It was about alignment, full circle. He had planted something in the soil of his youth, and now here stood the tree, and instead of taking from it, he had chosen to let its roots feed others. Later, during the public ceremony, he stood before the crowd, reporters, schoolchildren, city officials, and spoke from the heart. "I come here today not to celebrate a pair of shoes," he said, "but to remind us what shoes can mean when you've never had a pair. These aren't valuable because I wore them. They're valuable because of what they represent. Resilience, belief, and the idea that greatness doesn't require perfect conditions. Just opportunity." He looked down at a group of children near the front, boys and girls with bright eyes, many of them holding basketballs, some wearing his jersey. "I see myself in you," he said, "in your faces, in your energy, and I want you to know, this isn't just a story of what I did. It's a map for what you can do, what we can all do when we hold on to faith." The applause was steady, rising with every word, but it wasn't about spectacle. It was communion. After the ceremony, he spent hours with the kids, laughing, playing, teaching footwork drills, signing autographs not out of obligation, but love. And before he left the building that day, he made one final request. "I want to start a program," he told the museum director. "We'll call it One Pair Ahead. For every child in Athens who needs shoes, who has the fire but not the fuel, we'll give them what I once received, not just a pair, but the belief that they deserve to play." The program launched that same year, hundreds of shoes distributed, camps held across impoverished neighborhoods. Giannis wasn't always there physically, but his presence was felt in every pair, every jump shot, every kid who ran faster just because someone believed they could. Back in Milwaukee, the story made headlines. But Giannis didn't talk about it much. He didn't need to. Legacy isn't built in interviews or highlight reels. It's built in silence, in what you choose to lift when no one's watching. There was a moment, months later, when he stood in the tunnel before a game. Jersey on, lights dimmed, the roar of the crowd starting to build. He closed his eyes. For a split second, he imagined he was back in Sepolia. Asphalt under his feet, the faint outline of a rusted hoop, the sky overhead as open as his future once was. He looked down at the shoes on his feet, custom, sleek, molded to perfection. But in his mind, he saw the old ones, still battered, still proud. He whispered under his breath, "You're still with me." And then he ran out, like always, with everything. Because the boy who had once slipped paper into the toe of an old sneaker had grown into a man who knew exactly what fit him now. And he wore it all past, present, and purpose with the same unwavering grace,